Have you ever found yourself daydreaming of moving out of the city limits and living in a small house, a small cabin, or even a tiny house, and be able to live a quiet, peaceful life away from the hustle and bustle and crazy hysteria of today's world? Now, it might not be an easy task, and it might seem flat out intimidating, but I'm here to tell you that it's not impossible because me and my family have done it. And for those who don't know, for the last 5 years we've been living here in our tiny house. And we are in a medium density residential area. I'll get into a little bit of zoning stuff later. But I just want to let people know that if you're feeling like that life inside of a high density populated area is just not for you anymore, you can make moves to make your life a more peaceful and better place. So stick around in this video for some very important tips on your property search for your small homes. So hopefully you won't make some of the same mistakes that we did when we first started looking for properties for our tiny house. So let's get started. Now, I think we got very lucky in finding the land that we ended up being on and purchasing, but we made many mistakes that could have been costly, especially if we hadn't gotten zoning approval from our county, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Now, even though in our specific instance here, I'm talking about how we found land for our tiny house, I think a lot of these strategies and tips that I'm going to mention in this video will be relevant to many other kinds of homes that you might want to put on your property in your property search. Now, the first thing to remember when you're starting your land search for your tiny home, small home, whatever it is that what you're trying to do is outside of the norm of expectations. So in that respect, you also have to be thinking outside of the box in the same manner. For instance, you may have certain aspirations of where you'd like to end up, but you might have to curb those lofty expectations and be flexible with your expectations, especially if you don't have a huge budget for land. So now I'm going to talk about specifically 3 different things that you should be looking at when looking to buy land for your tiny house. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is where to look. Now, you could look for land so many different places. You could find land on eBay, on obvious places like Zillow and Realtor.com. You might not believe this, but my wife actually found the land that we purchased for our tiny house on Craigslist. She found our property for sale on Craigslist, and when we came to look at it, we just knew right away that this was the place that we were going to be. We just felt it our first time here. Another good site for searching for land is called LandWatch. I often find myself going on there, even though we live here and don't really need land. I'm always looking to see what things cost and things like that. But the searching for where you find these properties doesn't really matter. The most important thing is knowing what you're looking for when purchasing a property, which is going to bring me to my next point, which is characteristics that you want to look for finding land for your small house. So let's get into certain characteristics you want to look for when looking for land. So to start, this is going to depend on whether you want to be on the grid or off the grid. Now, if you want a property that's going to be on grid, you want to make sure that you have access to water, or if you're going to have to drill a well, you're going to want to know whether you can connect to electricity and whether there's a cost there. And sewage, your sewer, you want to figure all that stuff out. That's important things to know. But whether you're on grid or off grid, the one main thing you're going to want to know right away is whether your property is in a flood zone. Because if you're in a flood zone, you're going to have your tiny house just float away, and that's not good. Another thing I've found about flood zones is that when you're looking for properties, you often find some low prices for certain lands, and when you go and dig a little bit deeper, you find out that that property is in a flood zone, and that is why the price is so low. So it can be a little disheartening to find that stuff out, but it's things that you just need to know, especially if you want to grow food on that property. You don't want to be growing your food in a boggy, land that's kind of swampy and stuff like that. So, something to keep in mind. Now, there may be a cheap lot that is for sale and might get you excited. However, if you look at the surrounding homes in the area, you'll all notice that they're all like 3,000 square foot cookie cutter homes. And don't be a fool thinking that you'll just be allowed to park your tiny house on a piece of property next to all these huge homes. Housing developments like that have certain zoning regulations to maintain property values in the surrounding homes. But in reality, do you really want to be living in an area like that, surrounded by all homes that look the same? I know I don't. So what I've found is really important when searching for land for a tiny house, or any kind of small home outside of the norm, is you want to find a diamond in the rough. Now, what do I mean by that? You want to look for properties that have been for sale for over a year and haven't sold. And in those cases, the sellers might be more willing to make a deal or make an exception in any certain area that it might be to have any kind of house there, because homes in a certain county or whatever means tax dollars that they get. So they want to have population in these areas. So they might make an exception for you. So I'll give you an example of that with an experience we had. So there was another property that we looked at that we didn't end up purchasing that was in a neighboring county. And so I think we found it on realtor.com, and we sent a message on the app to the listing agent. And we told the listing agent, hey, this is what we want to do. We want to park a tiny house on this property. Would we be willing to or able to do that? And she got back to us very quickly and told us that she would contact the local zoning authority and figure out whether we'd be able to do that. And then she got back to us again and told us that yes, we would be able to park our tiny house there as long as we hooked up to electric, had a well dug. We would have to get a well dug, and that our tiny house was connected to a permanent foundation like a regular house. So as long as we filled all that criteria, we would be allowed to park our tiny house on this property. Now, upon further inspection, when we got to the property, we realized that it was really, really close to a major interstate, and that's probably why it was on sale for so long and why it was kind of cheap. So we didn't end up purchasing it because of those reasons. But those are the kind of questions that you need to be asking. You need to be right up front and just say, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm looking for, what do we have to do to make this happen? Because those are deal breakers. You don't want to purchase a property and then find out later that you can't put your tiny house there legally. That would be a big mistake, and one that could have happened to us, which I'll get into a little bit later in this video. So basically, for that property, they didn't want us to be off-grid in that area. Now, if you're looking for more of an off-grid setup for your tiny house, small house, whatever, I would search for recreational land. Recreational land is something that hunters would purchase to have places to set up, temporary shelters and rustic cabins, things like that during hunting season so they could hunt on their property. Another thing to look for is unincorporated townships. Unincorporated townships are townships that basically have no municipal, authority because the population size is so small. So another benefit of that is areas like that, taxes are really low. And you could also get by with very little rules and regulations regarding specifically zoning because in those areas, there's no authority to enforce them. So that's really cool. The downside to that is, if it snows and the weather's bad, you probably don't have people there to plow your driveway and stuff like that. So you have to be responsible for that, and also probably the local roads in that area. But unincorporated townships is something you could do a very simple search for online and find them in your state. Now, I want to make one more point I forgot to mention about the property that we purchased, and that is that we are in a borough, and essentially almost all of our entire borough is in a flood zone. We're in an area that gets some really bad floods and waters that go through town, and it's pretty bad when we get some pretty intense rains. However, the property that we found is not in one of those flood zones. We're a little bit more elevated and we have really good drainage on our property. So my theory is, going back to what I was talking about, finding a diamond in the rough, is that we got a good deal on our property, we are not in a flood zone, and I think that our county actually may have made an exception for us to put our tiny house here, even though it doesn't look like all of the surrounding homes. We do have some direct neighbors that have very large homes, and it kind of sometimes looks like our neighbor behind us has a really big old farmhouse that actually has an addition built onto it, and it kind of looks like we're living in a shed in their backyard. But that's beside the point. I think our county may have made an exception for us to, one, get more tax revenue from us living here. There had been a lot of people moving away from our area, as far as from what we've been told. So I think, finding this diamond in the rough, they were able to, or willing to, accept having us here in our tiny house, even though it's a different kind of dwelling than people typically live in. They were willing to make an exception for us to get that tax revenue, I believe, that they have been losing to people moving out of our county and the borough. All right, so that was all about different characteristics to look for when searching for land for a small house. Now the next point and last point I want to touch on is things that you need to know about zoning, and I'll get into specifically our experience applying for a zoning variance with our county to get the permission to put our tiny house here, being that it was smaller than the minimum square footage size dwelling that the county had, which was 500 square feet, and our house is obviously less than that. Now, something that I think that you should look for when looking for these properties is making sure that it's mobile home approved. Now, why would you want to do that? You might be surprised that a lot of properties specifically say in their details that it'll say specifically no mobile homes. They don't want mobile homes on this property for whatever reason. So finding land that was approved for mobile homes was essential for our search for a property for our tiny house, because we plan to explain in our zoning board appearance that, hey, we want to put a small mobile home on our property, and that's essentially what a tiny house is a mobile home. It's just a small mobile home. So that was our argument that we made to the zoning board. So if you are searching for property in a more highly populated area, I think you need to be aware that there are zoning laws and restrictions in place for that specific area, and you'll really want to dig into those files and find out what that is. In our county here, the minimum square footage for a dwelling is 500 square feet, which I think is pretty small relative to other places that I've seen. So we said that our house, including our loft, is 300 square feet. So we needed to apply for a variance because our house is smaller than the county's minimum square footage requirement. And in order to do that, we had to go in front of the zoning board for our county and make our plea to them as to why they should allow us to put our tiny house here. And if you're interested in finding out more about that whole experience, going in front of a zoning board to get approval for the tiny house, you can click the link. I'll either put it above and probably below in the show notes, because we did a blog post about that a few years ago, and you could check that out for more details. Now here is a big thing that I want others to learn from what we did, a mistake that we made that ended up working out in the end in our favor, but we were very naive. We were a lot younger back then, even though it was only 5-6 years ago. But listen, don't do what we did. Don't buy land before you have the zoning approval to put your tiny house on your property. Now, obviously, we ended up being successful and got the approval. We got our variance approved. But this whole experience of buying this property could have been disastrous if the zoning board had not approved our variance request. We would have been stuck here with this property that we can't park the tiny house on, that tiny house that we had already had purchased and was being built for us at the time. So that could have been a disaster, and we could have been lost a lot of money or had to sell the property, who knows. So luckily it all ended up working out in our favor. But I think in the future, for your sake, if you're trying to do what we did, I would, when looking for property, try to figure out or do some kind of thing in the contract that it is, make sure that it's pending, your purchase of the property is pending on whether you have zoning approval. Because if you don't have that, then you can't put your house there anyway. So looking back, I think we would have tried to make sure that we could have got the approval first before actually purchasing the property. That would have made a big difference in stress, because we were very stressed out at that time, hoping and worrying, hoping for the best, but worrying like what would happen if they didn't, if they said no, you can't put your tiny house there. That would have been a disaster. But luckily that didn't happen. But don't make that mistake. Make sure that you can put the tiny house or whatever kind of small home that you want on your property before you buy it. Now here's a good tip for those that may find themselves having to go up in front of the zoning board in the situation that we were in. We used what is called a heartfelt plea. And basically, a heartfelt plea was like us. We weren't literally on our knees, but we were like kind of doing that in what we said, and it was just begging, like, please let us live here in our tiny house on this property. Please, it's our dream to live in a tiny house on our own piece of land and do this, and we'll be really good stewards of the land, and it will be a beautiful place, and even though it's different kind of home, it will be really unique and cool and improve the surrounding area here. That's your heartfelt plea, and it seemed to work for us. I think it might work for others in their situation as well. You really want to work to pull on the heartstrings of these members of the zoning board to get them to vote in your favor. But like I said, everything worked out in our favor, and we've been living here successfully for 5 years. No one's come and kicked us out yet, so hopefully that doesn't happen. And yeah, so I'm really glad if you stuck around to the end of this video. Thank you for watching. And if you're new here, please subscribe to our channel. We do a lot of videos about homesteading and gardening. And I decided to make this video, even though I'm not talking about those things, but really because you can't really garden or homestead without owning land. You need some kind of property to do that stuff. So even if it's ends up being just like 1/10 of an acre or 1/4 of an acre, we're here on a 1/2 an acre, but we're growing on a lot less than what we have. The point is, you can't do it without land, but even if you could only purchase a small piece of land, there's a lot of things that you could do. There's a lot of things that you could grow on just a small piece of land, and that's a lot of what we talk about here on this channel. So please, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to our channel and give this video a like if you found it helpful. And that's going to be it for this video. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.